Thank you very much, and thank you to all of the organizers for this, for inviting me to this event. The title of my talk today is Undocumented Literature. What is undocumented literature? How can literature, a category that would seem to describe certain kinds of published documents, be undocumented? My intervention here is based on my research on the experience of ordinary migrants who end up in situations of conflict with police or federal authorities. My perspective is that of a humanist. The deep focus of my study is not policy or infrastructure or even social constructs such as community. Instead, I'm concerned with everyday human experience. What I'm going to present today is meant to apply this humanist lens to question some of the liberal arguments that underlie much humanities and social science research on migration. I'll focus my discussion on the story of a single undocumented Mexican immigrant whose story represents the extremes of injustice to which undocumented immigrants may be subject. I should mention that I'm a specialist in Mexican culture. The week of November elections, I happened to be in Tijuana, where I was initiating a digital storytelling project focusing on the consequences of deportation in the lives of ordinary people. With the elections, I questioned whether now is the time to challenge the ethics of liberal discourse in support of some immigrants. But as we grasp for some ground, legal, logical, economic, moral, to oppose what's coming at us, the construction of a wall, mass deportation, legal battles with sanctuary cities, fomentation of anti-Mexican xenophobia, we need to think about the implications of our own abstract arguments in human terms. When we argue for the protection of children brought to the U.S., protection of those brought to the U.S. as children, or for keeping families together, or for recognizing the contributions of tax-paying laborers, or for shielding law-abiding migrants from persecution, who are we leaving out? Whose detention or deportation are we implicitly authorizing? And what violence might that imply? Today I'll present the story of Roberto Rangel, whose testimonial narrative won a national prize in Mexico and was published with a great deal of fanfare there, with the help of Ana Luisa Calvillo, a journalist from Chihuahua. In 1995, Roberto Rangel, who was born in 1974, like many other Mexican campesinos, chose to leave his native village in Michoacan and seek his fortune in the United States. Illiterate and naive, he managed to cross the border, settling briefly in Fresno, California, where he soon became a father, but ended up getting deported when the mother of his daughter committed fraud, and he chose to protect her by assuming responsibility for the act. However, upon being returned to Mexico, he claims that he was given contact information for a U.S. immigration officer who then helped coyotes to smuggle him back across the border, delivering him to corrupt officers of the Fresno Police Department's narcotics division. He was signed on to be an undercover police informant required to deal drugs in order to obtain inside information for criminal investigations carried out by the Fresno police, while also earning money for them from his drug proceeds. He alleges that the officers assigned to supervise him promised to reunite him with his daughter and pay him a salary in exchange for his work with the police. Not only does he assert that he was rarely paid, but also that he was subject to threats, violence, and even rape at the hands of his supervising officer. Deeply embedded in Fresno's violent drug-dealing underworld, he himself began to use drugs and soon found himself in all kinds of unsavory situations from which he found no escape, eventually ending up at the scene of a drug-related homicide. Although he claims to be innocent, he was accused of the murder. In an absence of conclusive ballistic evidence, he was convicted based on eyewitness testimony that he believes to be the result of coercion on the part of the Fresno police. Only after his conviction and 57-year jail sentence in 2002 did he realize that he was poorly defended and that his trial, in his opinion, was a sham. His awkward attempts at appeal failed. With little hope for justice, he taught himself to read and write in prison, sending out pleas wherever he could, but no one responded. Neither churches nor charities nor activist groups wanted to touch the case of an undocumented convicted murderer. The response to the old question, can the subaltern speak, seem to be that there are some subaltern voices that society believes don't deserve to be heard. But he persisted, his story eventually crossing back across the border, landing in the hands of Mexican journalist Ana Luisa Calvillo, who helped him craft a first-person narrative that then went on to win the Carlos Montemayor Prize for Best Testimonio in a national competition sponsored by Mexico's Instituto Nacional de Bellas Artes in 2013. Initially published in Mexico in 2015 in book form by the Ficticia Publishing House in collaboration with Mexico's now defunct Consejo Nacional para la Cultura y las Artes, el Instituto Chihuahuense de la Cultura, and el Instituto Nacional de Bellas Artes. It was launched with great fanfare in Mexico's Palacio de Bellas Artes and generated significant attention in the national media in Mexico. Roberto Rangel's testimonial narrative is especially remarkable because it is an eloquently elaborated autobiographical tale written by a very ordinary Mexican immigrant, or rather a Mexican immigrant whose life had been very ordinary until he first got deported. Part of that ordinariness lay in his poverty, his marginality, his illiteracy. Those of such humble circumstances rarely get to tell their stories, and when they do, they rarely find an audience, let alone the kind of readership guaranteed by a national prize. Rangel's story confirms the fears of many Mexicans, what Zygmunt Bauman might call liquid fears, amorphous and generalized fears regarding the extreme abuses to which undocumented immigrants are subject. For the undocumented, dissimulation is often key to personal security. This means staying under the radar, not drawing the attention of police or other state authorities. Rangel, employed and protected by the police, could not conceal himself from them. Indeed, he was dealing drugs they gave him and turning in sales revenue to them. His movements were closely monitored at all times. While this situation may have allowed him to seek their protection on occasion, he had no way of protecting himself from their abuses, which were the ones that most imperiled his existence. To many Mexicans, this story is not surprising. The utter vulnerability of the undocumented immigrant in the face of the heavily militarized border regime and the rampant xenophobia and nativism is well understood in Mexico. But if this is the case in which the subaltern are allowed to speak, it is not true that they can speak wherever they want, to whomever they want, in whatever language they want. Let me insert an aside here to introduce the term differential inclusion. This term has been used in a variety of contexts related to borders and migration. At the level of the state, it has been applied to think about subordinate categories of citizenship in which individuals are granted some rights, but not the full set of privileges and protections associated with citizenship. The DACA program would be a clear example of this. Removal programs, including secure communities and priority enforcement, would similarly purport to enact differential inclusion. However, the notion of differential inclusion might also apply in civil society to the way that individuals treat each other in everyday interactions, or the way political activism formulates its missions and priorities. A case of that is a case like that of Roberto Rangel, seen not from a Mexican but from a US perspective, might cause us to question how all of us implement our own acts of differential inclusion in our everyday lives. When we advocate for protections from deportation or paths to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, which ones do we have in mind? Despite its success in Mexico, in the United States, this autobiographical narrative of an undocumented immigrant remains undocumentable. If the extreme conservative intolerance if extreme conservative intolerance is based on another liquid fear, the idea that Mexican immigrants are likely to be deadbeats, drunks, bandits, smugglers, gang members, drug traffickers, rapists, or murderers, there is a similar but unrecognized and never articulated liquid fear embedded in liberal tolerance, the fear that Mexicans may indeed sometimes be criminals. Liberal discourse emphasizes the plight of promising scholars brought to the U.S. as children, hardworking field hands who help bring our food from farm to fork at affordable prices, longtime residents who have paid years and years of taxes into a system that denies them benefits, extended families at risk of being torn apart, law-abiding folks who many assume to be citizen compatriots who act as good citizens should, despite lacking the basic rights even of authorized temporary residents. Liberal discourse cannot portray Mexican immigrants as antisocial delinquents, thereby tacitly enacting a practice of differential inclusion. The term criminal sets what often becomes a rigid border of exclusion that is symbolized by the prison wall but extends outward even as those convicted of crimes having served their terms leave. While subtle schemes of differential inclusion may be applied to convicted criminals, criminality is often seen in absolute terms. Differential inclusion tends to be applied based on the gravity of the crime, felony versus misdemeanor. But other considerations are not so common, rarely come up in discussions of deportation. Convicted felons are at the top of the list, regardless of whether they are violent psychopaths or ordinary people who happened to make a single bad decision. They can be seen in recent discussions of human smuggling. Coyotes tend to be uniformly vilified, whether they're professional extortionists, kidnappers, and rapists, or ordinary immigrants who occasionally offer their home as a safe house or drive groups of immigrants from one point to another in order to make a little money and to help others as they had been helped in the past when they crossed undocumented into the U.S. So returning to the context of the U.S., and Roberto Rangel, what happened when this prize-winning book was presented to major university presses in the United States? This story, moving as it is shocking, is a page-turner. It's a story of precariousness, abuse, injustice that must be told. Several publishers expressed great interest, one offering a preliminary book contract based on the Spanish-language manuscript. However, once translated, despite positive peer reviews, the contract was subsequently withdrawn. Rangel's story remains unpublished in the United States for fear of legal repercussions. If the story is true, it must be told. But what if it isn't? What if Rangel is a liar? What if he is a criminal? What if he passed bad checks? What if he shot that man in a Fresno bar? What if he is now slandering those whose testimony led to his conviction? The fears of publishers are parallel to those of the activist organizations that Rangel contacted that chose not to help him. If this is a case of injustice, it's an extreme one. But if it is not, drawing attention to the case of an undocumented immigrant convicted of murder would only feed the liquid fears of conservatives and end up endorsing current anti-immigrant rhetoric. I cannot argue whether Roberto Rangel is more or less likely to be guilty of the crimes for which he's been convicted. Instead, I point to his case's plausibility. If it were not believable, it could not have won a National Testimonial Award in Mexico, nor could it have landed a preliminary book contract in the US. Everything that Rangel narrates about his life is feasible, even if much of it cannot be proven true. Parts of it are verifiable. For example, the Fresno police admitted having hired him as an informant, even claiming when he sued them for monies he alleged they owed him to have paid him, despite knowing that he was undocumented. His version of what happened in the bar that night, and he admits having been there and he admits carrying a loaded firearm that he was not legally authorized to possess, makes logical sense, but can't be proven. I suggest that the subtleties of the case might encourage us to reflect on the ethics, the differential inclusions and inclusions that are implicit in our politics, in that of our own rhetoric, our own activism. If those who immigrated as children deserve protection, does it mean that those who came as adults do not? If we argue for holding families together, does that mean immigrants who came to the US alone, leaving their families behind, should be at the top of the list for deportation? If those who have paid into the tax system deserve compensation, do those who chose to protect themselves by working in the underground economy deserve exclusion? If those who obey the law merit legal defense, what of those who have broken the law? Should they be treated as innate criminals, always worthy of deportation? And what if someone like Rangel, who claims to have confessed to fraud to protect his pregnant girlfriend, who claims to have been framed for murder? I'll admit that after the election, I considered stepping away from this project due to its unattractiveness for liberal activism, especially when we must react against a rhetoric that is now coming to inform national migration policy that portrays undocumented Mexican immigrants as criminals. Rangel did not migrate as a child. He came to the U.S. alone as a young man. He has a very scant record of non-illicit labor. He was deported once and was later convicted of murder. He doesn't fit into any of the categories of immigrants we're accustomed to defending. His life in the violent criminal underworld of drug dealing, even if he did not choose to live that life, only confirms a popular stereotype of the unsavory, unscrupulous, brutal Mexican gangbanger. Yet if there is injustice in his case, as Rangel eloquently claims, and as Mexicans readily believe, why can't his story at least be told in the United States? Rangel was never interviewed by the press. The press did not document his version of the story, nor did he testify at his trial. Our legal system did not document his version of his story. He ended up in jail with very nearly a life sentence, and yet his side of the story to this day, nearly 15 years after his conviction, remains undocumented in the United States. It's ironic that in Mexico, where Rangel had never been undocumented, his story was documented and widely disseminated, while in the United States, where he has always been undocumented, his story too goes undocumented. What justifies that a story that someone urgently wants to tell be left undocumented? And why is it that this undocumentation seems more likely in the case of an undocumented immigrant? Should our activist concerns about Mexican immigrants be limited only to children, to families, to taxpayers, to hardworking laborers? Should we care about people like Roberto Rangel in the age of Trump? Thank you.